Welcome to the Meat and Potatoes podcast. Today we are joined virtually by Ryan Somerville, who is the general partner at Antler VC, and he represents the Mountain West area, which is Colorado, Montana, Utah, and a few others. We'll let him expound on that, but pretty good region of the world. How are you, Ryan?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. I have heard a lot about Antler and spent some time on the website. It looks like a big, ambitious undertaking. Very, very cool. And kudos to whoever designed your website. It's very fun and informative, and you gather a lot of intelligence really quickly on that. But for those that aren't familiar, what is the story of Antler and your role in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be sure to pass along the compliments of the marketing team. So Antler, I guess the origin story, we started the firm in Singapore back in 2018. So that's where we initially launched our first program. Since then, we've grown to 22 cities across the world, all operating within kind of the same mandate, which is to support early stage entrepreneurs at the true beginning of their journey. So, as a VC fund, we're investing earlier than virtually anyone on the planet, but also doing it across the planet. So started in Singapore back in 2018, and then we started to expand across the world over the past 6 or 7 years. I came on board to launch the US initially in New York, and that would have been the summer of 2019. So I just crossed the 4-year mark for the US fund. So we landed in New York back in the summer of 2019, started to raise our fund, started to interact with founders. We essentially had nothing. We were just set up in a Brooklyn warehouse and trying to figure this thing out. Ran our first program in the fall of 2019, made our first investments in January 2020, obviously before COVID broke out, especially in New York, and everything got pretty weird. But we were already working with founders at that point, which I'll get into. But we expanded down to Austin, Texas. So I moved there about 2.5 years ago to launch our second location. And then now I'm based, as you referenced, in the Mountain West, specifically in Boulder, operating the third location that we've launched. So I've been on a personal journey, launching Antler across the U.S., but many folks like myself have been doing the same kind of thing, globally. Across Europe, we have a really significant contingent. East Africa, we have a presence. Australia, several locations in Southeast Asia, as well as India and further north in East Asia. But everyone's essentially committed to the same mission, which is to support entrepreneurs at that, kind of beginning point. So the way that we do it is through these residency programs, which is fairly analogous like an incubator or accelerator, but again, just earlier stage, and also investing at the end of the process, which I think is an important difference. So the way that we operate is we run these programs, and this is speaking for the US specifically, twice a year. They're about 8 weeks long. We accept roughly 3% of total applicants into these rooms. And the programs for the US run simultaneously across Boulder, Austin, and New York. And those founders are, coming from either a corporate context. So, maybe it's an engineer at Google who's always wanted to found a company, but doing this on your own in your local coffee shop or, in your attic and trying to piece it together is a super lonely journey. And I would argue a less productive journey than doing it alongside a community of fellow founders. Which is really the initial premise is how do we create the physical space and kind of the mental white space for founders all at the same stage who are looking to solve meaningful problems to interact with one another, really at the beginning of their journey. So it maps onto folks coming out of a corporate environment, whether that's big tech or consulting or law or banking or whatever it might be. I just got a call with a veterans group. We have a lot of folks that come in from like the special operations community who are leaving the military, who are looking to build companies as the next step as opposed to going into a corporate environment. So Antler is essentially solving a problem as being, I guess, a landing pad for folks who are looking to build a company. They've always had an idea in their head. They want to get into the driver's seat and build a company. It's always been an ambition, but again, doing it by yourself is a hell of a lot more difficult than doing it surrounded by a community and the resources and eventually the capital that Antler will offer at an earlier stage. And then trying to do this thing on a global scale, because our fundamental thesis is that talent is fairly evenly distributed across the world, but opportunity and certainly capital is not. And that's particularly acute outside of Silicon Valley. I think that Silicon Valley has solved that problem, in some ways intentionally, in some ways just by the critical mass that they've built, where you can go to a local coffee shop and potentially meet a co-founder or develop an idea. That's not the case in many parts of the country and the broader world, which is why we've intentionally stayed out of the Bay Area, although we get a lot of founders from that region as well. So yeah, that's essentially what we're focused on. So the first 8 weeks are really organized around validating the problem statement, whether you came in with one or whether you discovered one at the earliest stage, beginning to build a solution, and a prototype or an MVP. It's usually quite bare bones at that early stage. Emphasizing speaking with as many customers as possible. So there's a huge kind of customer discovery and validation, bent to the initial phase of the program. And then pitching Antler's investment committee at the end of that process. So as opposed to other incubators that you'll be familiar with, who invest in slightly more mature companies, but at the outset of their program, our commitment is to work with founders over the course of this 8-week period so that we can get to know whether we would be a good fit for them. But they also, on the other side of the table, can discover whether they want to get involved with Antler for this 10-year marriage that we're about to embark on, which I think a lot of folks in my experience, especially on the venture side, often neglect the long-term, kind of marriage that you're getting involved with these founders. So I think it's a really valuable opportunity at the stage that we play at for folks to discover, one, whether they want to build a venture-backed solution. And oftentimes someone will come into the program and realize that their solution is better oriented toward a lifestyle business or an SMB, which is a great outcome for them. It's obviously not what our business model is built on, but a certain percentage of those folks will progress to our investment committee. And then they'll receive an investment. The terms of that investment are $250K, just sub a $3 million valuation. So about 9% is 2.75. So about 9% at the end of our process. And then they graduate into the second phase. I'll also mention that we offer a relocation stipend for anyone coming outside of the core cities that we're based in. So if you're coming outside of Boulder, Austin, or New York, you qualify for a $2,500 kind of cost mitigation stipend of flights and hotels and things like that. Which is quite important because most of our applicants are coming from non-core hub cities that we're based in. So to give you a point of contact, about 50% of my last Boulder cohort came from out of state. So those are folks coming from areas like where you're based in Utah or Montana or New Mexico, Idaho, whatever it might be, but also people coming from California, which obviously has a huge population advantage as well as just the sheer tech density. So it's more about creating a destination effect for folks to come to a place like Boulder, build a company over the course of 8 weeks. And then we're fairly agnostic as to whether you stay in Boulder, which is certainly an option, or whether you go back to Salt Lake City or SF or LA or whatever it might be. So that's part of the offering as well. But back to the point, should we invest? We invest $250K at the end of that 8-week process. And then you're rolled into the portfolio phase, which I think is where Antler really stands out as an offering. We, if anything, kind of intensify the nature of our support beyond that first phase. So once you have some capital in the door, helping companies with essentially finding product market fit. So business development and growth support, building the next generation of the technology. And that's done through, the founders themselves, first and foremost, but also the kind of concentric circles of access that you have. So access to my coaches here in Boulder, access to the coaches, broader in the US, and then eventually this kind of global interconnected web of my peers, as well as the advisors that we have, on board, to really try to move the needle as much as possible for those companies during the most critical time. I mean, that really is the valley of death where companies can, either make it or unfortunately fail. So we have a whole support apparatus after the initial check that's dedicated to finding product market fit, also helping companies with bringing on early hires. So I referenced the kind of co-founder piece in the first phase, which I think is a significant part of the value prop. But beyond that, helping companies with their first 10 executive hires, for instance. So how do you bring on, the highest quality VP of engineering, the highest quality VP of sales? Those type of hires tend to make all of the difference in terms of finding product market fit, as well as being able to raise subsequent capital and go on to build something really meaningful. So given the scope of our network, we can really be helpful there. And that's true on a global basis. But if you think about the sheer volume of applications that we get, some of those folks, the 3%ers that I referenced, might be great as a founder in the program, but other folks might be more interested or be better suited for an early stage kind of executive hire within the portfolio companies. So that's kind of the third pillar of the portfolio phase. The last thing I'll mention in that category is focusing on downstream fundraising support, which is where I spend a lot of my time personally. My thesis, and this has been validated over the last 4 years, is so many founders waste endless time and energy having coffee chats with VCs, people like yourself or me, trying to build momentum on the round. And it's an objective waste of time most of the time. I think that it's a huge distraction from what the founders should care about and ultimately what the VCs are underwriting, which is, can this founding team build and sell technology? And that's a generalization, but oftentimes it really is as simple as that as you progress from a pre-seed round that we would lead into the seed round that we're helping with. So the way that we've organized it is we do these investor releases, which is similar to like a demo day in the YC example, where we're releasing companies systematically to market and trying to do as much heavy lifting as we possibly can for those companies to get access to downstream capital at the right time from the best funds that we can possibly source. And that's not necessarily, tier one VCs, although they fall into that category, but the most strategic investor who's really going to be helpful at the next stage, and then doing it on terms and prices that make the most sense. We also, from our own funds, will follow on in a meaningful way into the seed round. So we're never setting the terms of that subsequent round, but we are following on. So we're not running into the problem of kind of marking up your own homework, but we can be a reliable source of capital for our companies, which continues to be a factor far beyond when they graduate from our first phase of our program. In addition to our kind of local follow-on capital from a US perspective, we also have a global continuity fund that's exclusively dedicated to doing Series A through Series C investing. So the long-term ambition of Antler is that we can be a financing partner and, I suppose, a resource partner for these companies from literally day zero when you quit your job and join the program, all the way through proper maturity and kind of fulfilling that promise of we're going to be there as a value-add supporter for that kind of 10-year marriage that I referenced earlier. And then I suppose, on the kind of differentiation side beyond the portfolio support, the fact that we're global, I think, is going to pay huge dividends for our companies, as they start to scale. We're starting to realize some of that now as we have more mature companies, especially out of Southeast Asia, which is our oldest fund. The TAM in some of these markets just isn't sufficient to build unicorn style companies. So accessing the global marketplace becomes quite relevant. And that's true for any company, but the difference is that we can plug you into this infrastructure that we've built, which has been absolute hand-to-hand combat for the last 6 years. But it's hugely beneficial where if I have a company at a Series A or B level that's considering expansion to, I don't know, Central Europe, I can plug them into my counterparts in Berlin, and they can help with the early hire issue that we referenced earlier, or the downstream VCs that they're connected with in Europe, or bringing on early hires, or basic things like office space, right? So like trying to just solve problems for founders as they expand globally, I think is going to become an increasingly core part of the value prop as Antler scales across the world. So that's kind of what we're up to. I think that supporting founders at the earliest stage, providing the right kind of infrastructure to help mitigate the reasons why startups often fail, both from a capital standpoint as well as filling the gaps from a resource perspective.
Wow. I'd be interested in how big your guys' whiteboard was when you crafted this, because it's very, very well thought out, and there's a bit of a magic wand there because you guys have kind of thought of everything. I kept waiting for like a gap, and there wasn't one. You kind of went from A to Z.
Yeah, well, one, I appreciate that. It's been a far more tumultuous journey, as you can imagine, than it might have sounded in that overview. But the way that we approach it is that Antler is a startup in and of itself, and we're just a startup that happens to invest and service fellow startups. But we've tried to follow the roadmap that I would advocate to the founders that I work closely with, which is build and iterate, move quickly, don't linger too much on mistakes. Don't break too many things, given that we're in financial services at the end of the day, but move quickly, adapt, and service the right customer. I think where a lot of VCs have made mistakes is getting too caught up in things that don't matter. Ultimately, the founders and talent is the core of our business. And if we can do a good job servicing them, we will ultimately be successful.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned the 3% that get in. And if I'm hearing this correctly, it could be a PowerPoint and dream, a greasy napkin, or even an idea that you were able to type out into the application. As these companies apply, what's the process? Are there interviews? If it just doesn't meet muster, is it just like a kind email? Ultimately, to like get your acceptance letter, what's that process like for them?
Yeah, it's a series of interviews and kind of application reviews. So, and we try to localize that as much as possible. So, going back to the comment around having a decentralized model, we're also, I suppose, operating our funnel in a fairly decentralized way. So, as a founder in Utah, for instance, you would be applying to the Utah program, or sorry, to the US program. Presumably, Boulder would be the best fit just geographically within that. So, you would go through the Boulder specific application process. So that's an application submission, through our website. It's a review, by our team to see if it's a good fit. It's a first round interview with someone on our team, and then it's a final round interview with myself or one of the partners in a different location. Depending on where you're applying. So we try to streamline it as much as possible, but it's probably still the most manual and human capital intensive aspect of what we do. It's also the most important thing that we can possibly do. And to your point around kind of the readiness stage, it could be even lighter than an idea on a napkin or something you can type out in an application. I'm really not vetting for ideas at the point of our application, and even to the point of our IC. I think that the idea is relevant insofar that it's a venture backable solution. I mean, we're obviously a VC. We have to create, venture outcomes on a multiple basis. And there has to be enough of a market there to do so. To the SMB, comment earlier. But I'm also taking into account that the idea is going to radically change from the point of your acceptance in the program, from the point of our investment, certainly from the point of pre-seed to seed, and then probably from the point of seed to Series A. So what I can control and what our investment thesis is built on is backing the jockey and not backing the horse in the sense. So backing the strongest founders that we possibly can, fully granting that the idea and the business model and even potentially the market they're going after is going to look considerably different at various funding stages. But if you can back founders that are willing to break through walls and be innovative and adapt, you have a reasonable shot of success. So to the point, what I'm really vetting for at the application stage is this a founder that has the grit and the tenacity and the commitment to build a company over the next 10 years? And the track record that to some extent demonstrates that commitment, whether that was in a corporate context to the earlier point, so someone that did something that was innovative and high growth at a Google or a SpaceX or an Apple or whatever it is, or was it someone who was a passenger at those organizations? And there's fairly simple questions you can ask to really arrive at a pretty conclusive result on that. So I'm looking for someone who really did something that was meaningful and high growth within a corporate setting, or someone that was a part of, a good example would be employee number 50 at Uber. So clearly they did something that was innovative and high growth. They weren't a founder at that organization. They certainly weren't, employee number 10,000 at an Apple, but they saw hyperscale in some meaningful detail. That sort of journey tends, in my experience, to map onto the kind of skill set that's necessary to build a company after the fact on
Very
your
cool.
own. Yeah, and then one thing I'll just throw in there, and the last bucket would be, and this is relevant for your audience in particular, is someone who's already taken the leap to start to build a company. So maybe they're already in their garage or in the local coffee shop trying to figure it out. They haven't yet raised institutional capital, but they've taken the leap and gone on to to just demonstrate, I suppose, the commitment to build a company. Antler can be a really valuable landing pad for those folks to build alongside fellow founders.
Yeah, I love it. All right, so you're one of the chosen ones. You make it through. A lot changes in 8 weeks for the world, but in particular, like people's lives change a lot in 8 weeks. I assume there's big transformations in y'all's 8-week program. Hit on a couple of key parts of what it's like. What do people go through? And I don't know, some funny anecdotal stories or some of your favorite things you've seen transpire from day one to the end of week 8.
Yeah, there can be some fairly radical changes from the beginning of the program to the end. And I think 8 weeks sounds, ostensibly like a short period of time, but to your point, there's a hell of a lot that can happen. And Antler time kind of ticks differently, over the course of the program, which I think is mostly an advantage because we see the kind of progress in this program that you would expect a company to see on their own within kind of a 9-month to a 12-month time horizon. But a good example is actually a Utah company that went through the program recently. The company is still in stealth, but the founder is called David Coronado. They're building in the prop tech space. I met that founder on a trip to Salt Lake back in February of this year, worked with them a little bit, kind of on the side, and then brought him into our program in March. He was able to go from essentially an incredibly basic concept around what he wanted to build, all the way through 100K plus in revenue over the course of the program, which is pretty phenomenal, and not outside of the scope of what we typically see. It's just an example that's close to home for you guys. He was able to also find a co-founder during the program. He actually brought in an existing co-founder that he had worked with previously, which the door is always open to do that. Bring on some early hires, get initial funding, obviously from Antler, and then start to raise some additional funding from some Utah VCs that you'll know very well. So that's kind of what we're aiming for is, problem statement, validation, initial MVP, which was true in his case, and then as much commercial validation as you can possibly get. The market speaks loudest, and I think too many entrepreneurs get caught up in, plucking ideas out of their imagination and over, kind of indexing on the whiteboarding phase and not going out there and talking to real customers, which is a massive emphasis of what we're up to here. I'll give you another example that's a little bit funnier. So one of our companies, which is now a kind of superstar of the portfolio and a company I'm particularly passionate about, called PowerX in the climate tech space, which I know is close to home for you. He's essentially now developed an IoT device that you plug into water heaters. Initially, it was residential, and now it's commercial. That essentially will monitor and then, I suppose, eventually optimize what your energy output should be. So it's pulling it's heating essentially water tanks on off-peak times from the grid and then kind of driving cost savings as a result. But he spent his entire time in our program, which was the first New York program in 2019, building a hydrogen scooter, which he was successfully able to pull off. It's just not a solution that we were particularly interested in backing. And he came to that conclusion actually, on his own. It's pretty difficult to then spin up the kind of charging or I guess hydrogen apparatus that you would need to create that scenario, but it is good for the planet. But he came into the program with as vague a problem statement as he wanted to solve a problem within climate change. The most specific he was able to get is reducing emissions. So over the course of that kind of 8-week program, he went from that vague problem statement to this hydrogen scooter idea to eventually PowerX. And then we made the investment under the pretense of who knows what this company is going to become. Maybe it's going to be PowerX, maybe it's going to be something else. But we know that this founder is incredibly innovative. We know that he has the grit and tenacity to pull this off. We know that he has the commitment, and we know that climate change is a significant problem that's worth solving. That became the thesis to back Manu, the founder, and eventually what PowerX has become. So that's just a point of contact on how early we're really going, as well as what the journey can look like for founders. But our commitment is to, again, back that jockey, not the horse. Who knows what this thing's going to become?
Yeah. I love that because there's a small element of like, all right, we'll roll the dice. This individual's not confused by much in the world, and they'll beat their head into a bloody pulp, smashing through these walls. And generally, you can have a pretty good ROI on those types of people in general.
Individuals.
Yeah. With a big footprint in the United States, and then obviously like a global footprint, that might require a lot of investors, funders, limited partners. Where do you guys get your capital from?
Yeah, so we operate the same way any other VC firm does. We obviously have more of a, I suppose, operational intensity to what we do, given the in-person physical nature of what we have and the amount of staff that it takes to service these folks. But the business model is the same. So how it functions is, when we launched in the US, the onus was on us to go and raise our first fund, which we did successfully at the kind of the first summer, I suppose, of COVID. So we raised a $35 million fund. That was initially just servicing New York. And then in some ways, out of necessity, we expedited our plans to launch subsequent locations, which became Austin and then Boulder. That was always in the cards, but we made the move to do it a little bit quicker given the environment. And then we're now in the process of raising our second fund, which will be considerably larger. And then you had asked a question offline about kind of the composition of LPs. So it's fairly scattershot. The first fund, given the sizing, as you can imagine, is going to be more geared toward high net worths, family offices, things like that. The second fund, which we're in process now, raising, is more geared toward institutions from a check size perspective. So working with state sovereign wealth funds and major pension plans and hospital systems and things like that. But I think our story from an LP perspective tends to resonate most with entrepreneurs who have been there and done it. Folks who see the story and kind of in hindsight can map onto their own success and say, hey, I would have really benefited from being a part of a program like Antler. The story, it tends to resonate most successfully with people who really have an understanding of how hard it is to actually build a company. We've had a lot of success along those lines, which is, I would argue, the most valuable contingent of LPs that you could possibly have. We tend to have a closer relationship with our LPs in some ways because of the nature of what we do than most venture funds would. So we can bring in, operators that have had a significant exit to come in and do, whatever speaker sessions or office hours or work closely with our founders over the course of the program. So there's an interesting opportunity to be quite involved with our LPs. And also many are involved for access to direct deal flow, which isn't uncommon within the space, but it's a little bit different for us where they can come in during the first phase, work with founders, identify someone like, the founder of PowerX, for instance, and say, hey, I want to get personal, direct exposure to that company, but they can do so over the course of the same due diligence period as what Antler is actually accomplishing on our own. So they can actually work closely with the founders before making that decision. And then there's fund exposure and insofar as you want it, direct exposure as a result.
Yeah, and you don't have to do a lot of the work because you guys and your team are going to do that for them.
Yeah, and that's also true with respect to downstream VCs. So I mean, Antler, by proxy of our investment stage, plays nice with almost everyone. I mean, no one's investing this early. So what we can provide to the market is essentially companies that otherwise wouldn't exist. I mean, these are companies that you really can't imagine a scenario where the two founders would have met one another outside of the context of Antler, generated the problem statement, and then built a company that maps onto now what they're doing further along. So it's really solving an economic development problem as well, which is that we need more entrepreneurs, especially in this country, but it's true globally. We need smart people to build solutions and not necessarily build them within the context of the corporate that they might be already exposed to. So huge economic development angle, but also a service, I believe, to downstream VCs who need more deal flow and are continually competing for access to the same deals when it should be more kind of broadly based. So a lot of the founders that I suppose get referrals for the program from would be a seed stage or a Series A stage VC who sees a really compelling founder. The KPIs aren't there from a kind of threshold perspective with respect to their thesis, but they can send folks to Antler. We can do the initial due diligence, work closely with those companies, and then pass them back along downstream. So it's kind of this two-way street that I think is quite valuable. And yeah, the same thing to your point maps onto LPs, but I think that VCs is as much of a relevant audience as well.
Yeah, for sure. Let's hit on a couple of operational points for those that interest is peaked. You mentioned twice a year, right? These 8-week cohorts programs. The next one for y'all is when?
Yeah, so we have one that we're currently in the kind of scouting cycle for. So we have a program kicking off on October 10th. Again, that'll be Austin, Boulder, as well as New York. And we do that twice a year, to your point. So we'll do one in the fall and then one in the spring. So the next one for 2024 would kick off in early March. But yeah, the one we have coming up is starting on October 10th. We're likely to close applications by the end of September. So we're full on in the kind of recruiting cycle right now.
Gotcha. And like you, I've looked at a lot of VCs, big, small, medium, and their portfolio companies. By the way, I love how you guys, like in one or two sentences, say what the company does. But if you're looking at a lot of those over the years, you're like, damn, if half of this actually happens, it's going to solve a lot of problems in the world, and a lot of people will have good returns. But like looking at your guys' portfolio across the world, it's touching on all sorts of stuff, big market opportunities, but a lot of it's like pretty exciting, whether it's like helping the environment or AI or like optimizing energy spend. It's got to be pretty exciting to interact with all of these folks and see like the kind of infinite potential. How do you guys like start to plan? Because you guys are already big, even though you're young. How do you guys start to plan future rollouts? How do you look at markets? How do you kind of build your teams for kind of getting new footholds across the world?
Yeah, I mean, we've to your point, we've spent the last 6 years expanding fairly rapidly across the world. So we have a pretty significant critical mass in most places. Europe probably being the best example. I mean, we're in almost every major market in Europe, especially with we just did a launch in Madrid, Lisbon, and Paris, fairly recently. So I think that the game plan going forward is to go deeper within existing locations with some fairly marginal expansion to cities that we're not yet in. From a US perspective, which is where my thoughts are day on, day out, is focusing on supporting founders to come to the regional hub. So it's kind of a hub and spoke model. So working closely in places like Salt Lake City, where there's a huge contingent of engineering talent, there's a huge contingent of, I suppose, business talent, but we're unlikely to launch a full-blown location in a place like Salt Lake because the proximity is so close to Boulder. It's an hour flight. So I'm spending most of my time now on expanding to these, kind of spoke cities in a more satellite way, where I would have a full-time hire, which we are currently in the process of planning, that's full-time in Salt Lake, but then coming to Boulder for the cohorts. So their full-time job is to interact with the local ecosystem in Salt Lake. So working with founders, obviously working with downstream VCs, to whatever extent working with LPs and ecosystem partners, like yourself, to try to spread the word and, I suppose, evangelize about what Antler is up to. But the intention isn't to launch the similar scope of what I have in Boulder in Salt Lake. The intention is to bring those founders to Boulder, which is also why it's important that we have this relocation stipend to help kind of mitigate the opportunity cost of folks flying out here for the 8 weeks. I think that with respect to launching new markets, it's likely that we'll launch a fourth in the US on the back of our second fund. Southern California has always been a priority of ours. I mentioned being intentionally outside of the Bay Area earlier, but there's a hell of a lot happening in places like Los Angeles and San Diego. Obviously, the tech density that I mentioned earlier is a relevant point, but there's a lot of innovation happening in those markets that I think does warrant a full-on hub. But that's probably a little bit further in the future. My focus right now is on the spokes. And planting a full-time hire in places like Salt Lake, or going and doing events in places like Seattle or Chicago or Boston or Miami, whatever it might be. I think there's a ton of talent that we can get in front of in those places that Antler is really solving a unique problem for, where there's not a lot of folks that generally play at this stage, but that's particularly acute in a place like St. Louis, for instance, where there's a little bit of downstream activity, but there's not a lot of folks who are really solving that problem at the earliest stage.
Gotcha. Well, color me impressed again. I think you guys have thought through a lot of the contingencies, and we're talking a little bit before we jumped on of how many things exist now for entrepreneurs that didn't exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago, let alone 15 years ago. A lot of like really cool programs and, funds like you guys that have seen things evolve, and I would say, really entrepreneurial friendly. So for whatever reason, you see on the Wall Street Journal occasionally, like, there's not as many entrepreneurs as there used to be. And obviously for us, like interacting with them constantly, it's like, that surely is a typo. But I think the data does show that for whatever reason, it is down, and doing it just for the fun, doing it for the story, let alone like the impact you can have and the lessons you can learn. I think it's a worthwhile effort. So thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us today, and looking forward to hearing about Utah companies that are involved in the program and watching their success. So thank you for your time, and kudos again. Like, very impressive what you guys are doing here.
Yes, thanks so much. Really appreciate the platform, guys. We'll be spending a bunch of time in Utah, so maybe we can do this in real life in the near future.
I'd love that. Cool. Thank you, Ryan.
Appreciate it.